Hello, everyone. You're listening to The Right Side of Gaming. Today, we're just going to go over all the white spells in Magic Legends. Thought it might be fun to go through each color individually, and then maybe at the end, we'll go over maybe some ideas on how to play the different color combinations. But I want to start by making sure everyone knows all the cards that are in the game, how they play. I'm pretty sure a lot of people haven't unlocked all of them yet. We probably haven't seen all of them yet. Or at least, individual players. So they're out there if you want to look them up yourselves, but a lot of us probably don't have the full 170 whatever in our library. So, we're starting with the white cards. We have the Phantom Prowler, which is a 2/2 cat with lifelink. So, right off the bat, whenever it attacks, you're going to get some health back. But if you kick it, that is, whenever you cast it, if you hold down the button to cast it, you're going to spend an extra 2 mana, so you'll be paying 4 instead of 2. But it's also going to heal you right off the bat when it's summoned, and it'll have the ability to heal you for more as it fights, in addition to that lifelink. So it doesn't make it stronger whenever you kick it, but it does heal you for more. Next we have the Chain Warden, a human soldier that will stun foes at the target location for 4 seconds. So it has a small AoE when you play it, and its ability will also stun for a short duration. It's always good to have some CC in your deck, it feels like. We have cards in white and in other colors that want to do extra damage to enemies that are under a CC effect. So this works out pretty well because it can both stun and continually stun. It's not going to do as much damage by itself as some of the other stunning spells, but it has potential to redo the stun, and it'll start doing more damage, and that'll build up for as long as it's on the field. We have Zealous Servant. It says whenever you take damage, it's going to gain +1/+1 up to +4/+4. So it starts off as a 1/2 human, and it can bump up to about a 5/6 just from its ability. Now it's whenever you take damage, not the creature takes damage. So if you're playing a build that doesn't have a lot of creatures, or even better, if you're playing something where you're playing spells that cause you, the player, to taunt enemies so that they attack you, the player, it's a great way to buff up your Zealous Servant, so I expect to see that in some tanky decks. We have Banisher Priest, that's going to do another stun in a target location when it's summoned, and another stun on its special ability, so it fills sort of the same role as the Chain Warden, basically. We have the Crusader of Audric, that gets a +1/+1 for every other creature you control. I know in some of my decks I've gotten 12, 13 creatures in the field pretty easily, so you can really pump that creature up pretty high if you're running a deck that wants to do a lot of creatures, a lot of tokens, if you are resummoning creatures as well, so that you have multiple copies of them on the field. We have a lot of artifacts and equipment that will make more creatures if you're doing a go wide strategy where you have a bunch of smaller creatures on the field rather than a bunch of big creatures, or more of a focus on sorceries or something. Then this can be a really powerful card. We have Fiendslayer Paladin that has lifelink, so his damage is going to heal you, and he will occasionally charge forward and deal damage. We have Faithful Geist, that whenever it dies is going to give you a shield, and it has an activated ability that you can sacrifice it. So whenever you draw it again, if you already have it on the field and you draw the card, you can pay to sacrifice it and get that shield, which means you're going to get a lot of death effects. So if you're playing a deck that has a lot of stuff that wants you to sacrifice or to have creatures die, this works out pretty well because the creature itself has the sacrifice effect. And you can also work it in either as a sort of defensive buff for you, or you might find a way to slip it in more tanky decks and just worry about getting the shield rather than making sure you get extra triggers and stuff off sacrifices. We have Vinalish Archers, which just summons 3 creatures, which may not seem like a lot, but 3 1/1s, I mean, that adds up, especially if you buff it. I mean, it's good for those sort of token decks where you have creatures that want to go wide. You want to make a bunch of creatures, a bunch of small creatures. It works out pretty well. We have Vinalish Marshal, which buffs all your other creatures. Which again, if you have a bunch of small ones, like with Vinalish Archers, giving 3 creatures +1/+1, so having a 6/6, instead of playing a 3/3 and having it bump up to a 4/4, I mean, that adds up. So he works out really well in decks that play a lot of smaller creatures. We're going to see that theme a lot in white. We have Galewing Griffin. It's going to deal damage and knock enemies back and then repel backwards as its special ability. So it pushes the enemy and then it goes backwards. So it's like they're both moving away from that center point. We have Light Piercer Angel. It has piercing, which means its projectiles are going to pass through enemies. So if it's attacking into a group, you're not only going to be hitting the first creature, but the other ones behind it. Works out pretty well because a lot of times they will just sort of crowd around you in game. And the special ability will deal damage to foes in a cone, and again, it's going to pass through enemies in that cone too, so that comes in handy. The Veteran Bodyguard, this says that any damage dealt to you is prevented and dealt to this creature instead. So that's another one for those really tanky builds where you want everything to be attacking you because you can just redirect the damage from you to the bodyguard. We have Angel of Vengeance that has lifelink, so its attacks are going to heal you. And on summon, it's going to do a big AoE attack. And I have used that to sort of clear crowds of mobs before. Fun. Divine Reclaimer is one of our mythics. Has an activated ability that will resurrect your strongest dead creature. So if you already have Divine Reclaimer out on the field and you draw into it again, you can revive one of your other creatures with it. If you're playing a deck that has a lot of big creatures, this is a great way to get some of them back for cheaper. So say a green-white deck or something. Or if you're playing a deck that sacrifices a lot of creatures, this just gives you a way to sacrifice them and bring them back and sacrifice them again. We have Victory or Death, which is one of our taunts. It's going to do damage and then taunt enemies. And that plays in with some of those tanky builds we've talked about already because you want to be able to taunt things with those. We have Banishment. That's going to exile foes at a location for a few seconds, which means they can't do anything. They can't take damage, but they're not going to deal damage either. They just kind of sit there and they're out of the fight for a few seconds. And sometimes that's enough. We have Chain the Wicked. That's going to deal damage and stun enemies that attacked you while you had that spell up. So kind of like that Bide attack in Pokemon. You get the spell up, they attack you, and this is going to deal damage and stun. And again, this is one of those that you can hold to have it spend more mana. So instead of a kicker, it has an X cost, so you just hold it down until you get to the desired amount. Or in this case, for as long as you're maintaining it, and it's going to spend mana as you hold it down. Next up, we have a Light Shield Barrier. So for about 8 seconds, you and your strongest toughness creature aren't going to take damage, and when the spell ends, it's going to deal damage to your enemies for about half the damage that your creature would have taken. Another one of those sort of bide type effects. We have Altruism. For 10 seconds, whenever you take damage, you're going to heal yourself and nearby allies for an amount. And this is one of those where if you are getting hit by a bunch of smaller creatures, like if you're in one of those crowded mobs or whatever, you're going to be taking a lot of smaller hits, and this is going to heal you every time, so that's great. Or maybe you're trying to do one of those tanky builds. This is going to heal you and your allies for some of it back every time you get hit. either way to make it work. We have Divine Wrath, which is going to do a small AoE and some damage and stun targets at that location. We have Spirit Offering, which is one of our kicker ones, so 3 mana for 3 Spirit Wells. That will just sort of pop up on the field, and when you walk through it, it gets consumed and heals people. Or you can hold it down and get 5 wells instead of 3. So you're just not making more healing. I mean, its total amount is more, but it's because you're making more wells that you have to run through. You have Unwavering Passage, which is going to have you charge forward, probably into a crowd, or you could probably use it to get out of a crowd too. You're going to charge forward, deal damage, and then taunt everything. See some recurring themes. A lot of the effects in here are either control effects like stun. We have these taunts for more of our tanky builds. We have healing, and we have a bunch of small creatures. We have Aura of Salvation. So for 5 seconds, you're going to heal yourself and nearby allies for an amount every second. So it's sort of a channeled heal over time. Just going to, for a small period of time, you're just going to be healing everyone for 1 second. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. And that feels very much like some of the MMO healing abilities I've played before. We have Radiant Volley, which is going to be another AoE stun. In this case, it's instead of in a circle, it's in a line. But you can hit multiple enemies with it. We have Zealous Charge, which is going to give the creatures you control +2/+2 for a small period of time. But again, if you have a lot of creatures out, those +2/+2s really add up. We have Healing Recall, which is going to heal yourself and creatures you control, and it's going to teleport creatures to where you are, so it's a great way to get them out of trouble if you need to. You have Radiant Shield. You and creatures you control gain a shield for 10 seconds. So it's sort of falls in that same category as healing. It's what we call damage mitigation. Sometimes it's through like direct healing, sometimes it's through shields, but it serves sort of the same purpose. We have another one of our mythics, Rebellion. For 8 seconds, creatures you control gain Retaliate. They deal their power and damage to their attacker when hit. It's a great one to pair with creatures that have taunt because they're going to be getting hit by everything, and then they're going to be dealing a bunch of damage back to everything that hit them. We have Revenge, which does an AoE damage. AoE in this case is a cone, and it'll deal more damage if you have 50% or less health. So if you're playing a build that is going to lose a lot of health, and we have some stuff in game where whenever it activates, you have to lose or pay health, and we have world enchantments and stuff. This past week we had one where you play a sorcery, it's going to do more damage, but you're going to have to lose some health. I mean, this pairs really well with things like that, because you're going to be intentionally lowering your own health anyway. Might as well get a damage boost out of it. We have Judgment. It's going to deal damage to nearby foes, and you're going to heal yourself and nearby allies for a certain amount. I use this a lot in sort of my mob wave clearing mode. We have Phalanx Charge. It's going to deal damage to enemies sort of in a line in front of you, but it's going to deal double damage to enemies that are affected by control effects. Like all those stuns that we have in white are going to pair really well with this because you stun them, then you Phalanx Charge for boosted damage. We have Heavenly Assault, which just does a large amount of damage and a big AoE. And that is just always fun to pull off. We have Ancestral Warp. So for 30 seconds, creatures you control have 50% reflect. So whenever they are dealt damage, a portion of that damage is being dealt back to the attackers up to an amount equal to your maximum health. So you can't go absolutely crazy. If you have a big boss attack that does a super amount of damage or something to them, I mean, you're only going to be able to reflect some of it back. but still, you're going to be reflecting damage. We have Restorative Boon, which is another enchantment, and for 30 seconds, whenever you cast a sorcery, you're going to heal yourself and creatures you control. If you're playing a sorcery-heavy deck, which you can do in white, and there's a couple color pairings that work out really well for that as well. Just a great way to give yourself a little sustain. We have another mythic, Provocation. And this enchantment is going to give you lesser resistance. You're going to take less damage for 30 seconds, and whenever you deal damage to a foe, you're going to taunt it for 6 seconds. So it's another great one for those tanky builds where you want to get up there and have everything attack you. This is a great way to make them attack you, and you're going to be reducing the damage you take. Finally, we have Glorious Anthem. So for 30 seconds, which this is a pretty long buff compared to some of the other +1/+1s we've gotten, creatures you control are going to gain +1/+1. Now, compare that to the 8-second +2/+2. This lasts a lot longer, even though it's smaller, but it's still going to work out really well with decks that want to run a bunch of smaller, weaker creatures. Again, that's kind of our themes in white. We have the damage mitigation. Most of it is healing. We have a couple shields in there, but we have the damage mitigation. We have sort of those tanky looking builds if you want to do more of a traditional video game tank where you're taunting things and having them attack you and maybe taking less damage. Then we have those sort of stun control effects. And finally, we just have a lot of stuff like this that wants you to go wide and have a bunch of smaller creatures to pump up. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what we have in the game at the moment for white, how it plays, and maybe give you an idea of whether or not you want to put some of these cards or this color in your deck, or maybe you decide, well, none of that really appeals to me, so I should focus on some of the other 4. That's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you'd like to leave a like, comment, subscribe, that would be great. If not, that's okay too. I understand. Either way, I hope you have an awesome day, and I will catch you next time.